Okay, I'm going to focus today's lecture on Weber's book on Islam. It's an unfinished work by Max Weber. However, some people think it's still kind of interesting as far as understanding Islam's failure to develop into a democratic society. Of course, as everybody knows, Weber focused on the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism as the main source by which modern society was able to charismatically break out of the stagnating or stagnant form of feudalism into the modern world. He then went on to study India, China, that is Hinduism, Confucianism, Taoism, Buddhism, etc., as contrasting and comparing religious elements which give light to understanding the development of society, certainly from a feudal into a modern world. Started a work on Islam, and he was then, once he was finished with that, he was to start another work on the Roman Catholic Church. Unfortunately, he did not finish his work on Islam, and certainly the work on the Catholic Church remained only sketchy. Okay, so let's begin. I shall make assistance from a J. Score article by Brian S. Turner. Over the last half century, a substantial tradition of Weberian scholarship has developed in Europe, which is focused on elaborate analysis of Weber's exploration of the relationship between religion and capitalism. Naturally, the scholarship has involved examination of Weber's basic contrast between the European tradition of Puritan asceticism and the mystical ethics of Asian religions. One consequence of this dominant sociological tradition has been a relative neglect of Weber's treatment of Islam. Although Weber died before completing his sociology of religion with a full study of Islam, his comments on early Islam and his more elaborate inquiry into Islamic law are sufficiently interesting to warrant more close attention than they have up until now received. As a prophetic egalitarian salvation religion with close derivation from Judaism, Christianity, Islam is a significant test of Weber's theses on asceticism and rational economic activity. Muslim reformers themselves came to explain the decay of Islam by using Weberian arguments. Weber showed that Islamic institutions were incompatible with capitalism because they had been dominated by a long history of patrimonialism. Islamic beliefs were certainly influential, but still secondary to patrimonial conditions, sort of like feudalism. Economic and social historians were probably the first to treat the Protestant ethic as a strong theory in which Calvinist beliefs caused modern capitalism. In addressing the issue of idealism and materialism, some modern sociologists have made the point that in fact Weber's theory is complementary with their Marxism. For instance, Hans Gert and C. Wright Mills claimed that Weber's task was partly to complement Marx's economic materialism, quote, by a political military materialism. They also suggested that as Weber became more embittered by German politics, he gave increasing prominence to material factors. A consideration of Weber's public lecture at Freiburg in 1896 on ancient civilization shows, however, a consistent Marxist undercurrent in Weber's sociology. Cyril Mills pointed out that his approach was compatible with Weber's definition of a motive as a complex of subjective meaning. The theory of motive implicit in Weber and elaborated by Cyril Mills is not incompatible with a Marxist treatment of ideas and ideology. There's no contradiction saying that vocabularies of motive determine social action, but these vocabularies are locked within specific socioeconomic context. Like Weber, Marx thought that the religious culture of feudalism was wholly irrelevant under capitalist conditions. New motives appropriate to capitalist social relations would evolve without atheistic campaign. It is not difficult to interpret Weber's analysis of ascetic motives in precisely these terms. Weber himself claimed that it was necessary to investigate how ascetic motives were shaped by the totality of social conditions, especially economic. Thus, Weber asserts that to explain actions, we need to understand the subjective meaning of social action. But the language which are available for describing and explaining actions are determined by socioeconomic setting. Weber's characterization of Islam started by recognizing that Meccan Islam was a monotheistic religion based on ethical prophecy which rejected magic. Given that Allah was all-powerful and omniscient and man predestined, asceticism could have emerged as a solution to a potential salvation anxiety, which is critical to the development of capitalism, as of course embodied in Calvinistic ideology or theology. Weber argued that asceticism was blocked by two important social groups: the warrior group, which was the main social carrier of Islam, and Sufi brotherhoods, which developed a mystical religiosity. Therefore, adapting Muhammad's monotheistic Quran to the socioeconomic interests of a warrior lifestyle, the quest for salvation was reinterpreted through the notion of jihad or holy war to the quest for land. Islam was turned into a national Arabic warrior religion. The concept of inner salvation never fully developed, and adherence to the outward rituals of the community became more significant than inward conversion. Ancient Islam contented itself with confessions of loyalty to God and to the Prophet, together with a few practical and ritual primary commandments as the basis of membership. Weber concluded that despite Islam's origin in Jewish-Christian monotheism, quote, Islam was never really a religion of salvation. The warrior group turned the religious quest into a territorial adventure, and Islamic asceticism was basically the rigor and simplicity of a military caste. Islam did, however, develop a genuine salvation path with ultimately religious goals, but this quest was mystical and otherworldly. Weber regarded Sufism as a mass religiosity which enabled Islam to reach its conquered subjects through their indigenous symbolism and ritual. Sufi mysticism thus introduced magical, orgiastic elements into Islam and watered down its monotheism. The combination of a warrior religiosity with mystical acceptance of the world produced all the characteristics of a distinctly feudal spirit. The obviously unquestioned acceptance of slavery, serfdom, and polygamy. The great simplicity of religious requirements, and even greater simplicity of the modest ethical requirements of a Protestant ethic. Given this religious ethic, Islam could not provide social leverage whereby the Muslim Middle East could be lifted out of feudal stagnation. Easy to assume that Weber postulated that Islam did not produce capitalism because it had a culture incompatible with the spirit of capitalism. Now we turn to Islamic law. Of course, we know that Weber was very much interested in how law was able to create an atmosphere in Europe that gave rise to capitalism. Of course, Russian tradition going back to Roman law, and which became modified in one form or another, was extremely important in the development of a stable capitalist trading society. At the center of Weber's sociology of law is a distinction between arbitrary, ad hoc lawmaking and legal judgments, which are derived logically from general laws. In the case of substantive, irrational lawmakers, do not follow general principles, as you would, let's say, in formal rationality of Western jurisprudence, but judge each case according to purely arbitrary factors. So we see here that, in other words, the distinction that Weber makes between substantive rationality and formal rationality. Formal rationality, of course, is a Western invention. Paradigmatic case of such law, in Weber's view, was the Qadi, that is, Qadi as substantive rationality, which judges each case on personal particularistic grounds. The law resulting from Qadi decisions lack generality and stability. However, Islam did possess a universal legal code, despite different legal schools, in the form of Sharia law, or holy law, which Weber categorized as substantive rational law. Law of this kind follows principles which are derived from sacred revelation, ideology, or a belief system imposed by conquest. The norms of Sharia were extra-legal in the sense of being derived ultimately from prophecy and divine revelation, whereas Qadi justice was unstable. Sacred justice was inherently inflexible and could not be readily extended systematically to meet new cases and situations. We further note that, according to Max Weber, the patrimonial economy and political structure, which explains the absence of a capitalist spirit of rational law and independent cities. Weber attempted to suggest an explanation in terms of the problems of financing patrimonial troops. The feudalization of the economy was facilitated when the Seljuk troops and the Mamelukes were assigned the tax yield of land and subjects. Eventually, land was transferred to them as service holdings. The extraordinary legal insecurity of the tax-paying population vis-à-vis the arbitrariness of the troops to whom their tax capacity was mortgaged could paralyze commerce and hence the economy, or the money economy. Indeed, since the period of Seljuk, circa 1050 to 1150, the Oriental market economy declined or stagnated. The decline of the money economy was accompanied by increasing arbitrariness in law, land rights, property, and civic relations. Weber summarized this political condition under the term sultanism, which described purely arbitrary decisions of a patrimonial ruler. Since property holdings became uncertain, the urban merchants interested in the Waqf, W-A-K-F-S, family, or that is, the family trust consecrated pious works, which were comparatively safe from interference. These investments encouraged an extensive mobilization of capital, which corresponded fully to the spirit of the ancient economy, which used accumulated wealth as a source of rent, not as acquisitive capital. So in other words, here we see the thwarting of some of the spirit of accumulation of capital by the system of patrimonialism. And therefore, since towns were merely army camps for patrimonial troops, and since patrimonial interference discouraged investments in trade and craft industry, a bourgeois lifestyle and ethic did not develop in Islam. Thus, Weber concluded that the prebendal feudalism of imperial Islam is inherently contemptuous of bourgeois commercial utilitarianism and considers it as sordid greediness and as the life force specifically hostile to it. According to this thesis, Islamic values and motives certainly influenced the way in which Muslims behaved in their economic, political, and social activities. But we can only understand why these values and motives were present by studying the socioeconomic condition of, that is, the patrimonial dominance and prebendal feudalism, which determined Islamic history. So as we can see, according to Weber, this warrior culture, just like in feudal Europe, the knights, the aristocracy, had a certain degree of contempt for the bourgeois class, or the acquisitive class within their society, and they always consider them a threat. And of course, we see this kind of rhetoric many times coming from terrorists themselves, who view Western society as greedy, as money-oriented, and therefore degenerate, decadent, hostile to religious views. How do the Muslims rationalize, for instance, the success of the West vis-a-vis the Holy Islamic Empire? The colonial expansion of Europe created an acute problem of theodicy. Theodicy, for those who don't know, means God's rationality vis-a-vis good and evil. If Islam is the true religion, how are infidels so successful in this world? The Muslim answer to this issue has been shared by the most diverse reformist movement, namely Christians, are strong because they are not really Christians. Muslims are weak because they are not really Muslims. In order to become really Muslim, it is necessary to rid Islam of foreign accretion and to discover original pure Islam, which is seen to be completely compatible with the modern scientific world. Pure Islam is based on an ascetic, activist, this-worldly ethic. The enemy of both pure Islam and modern society is a set of attitudes, fatalism, passivity, mysticism, which was introduced into Islam by the Sufis. Criticism of Sufism has been, of course, a persistent aspect of Orthodox Islam over the centuries, but there is a new emphasis in the contemporary rejection of Sufi mysticism, namely that it is a drain on economic resources and is incompatible with asceticism and activism. And so therefore we see almost like an infantile reaction on the part of Orthodox Muslims, basically to blame somebody else for their problems. Okay, so to recap, Weber shows that rational law, autonomous cities, and independent burgher class and political stability were totally absent in Islam. Therefore, the monotheistic Islam of Makkah failed to develop into an ascetic, this worldly religion because its main carrier was a warrior group. The content of the religious message was transformed into a set of values compatible with the mundane needs of this warrior group. The spiritual element of Islam as a belief system with emphasis on salvation was transformed into the secular quest for mundane gains. Second, the original message of monotheism was subjected to change under the impact of Sufism, which catered for the emotional and orgiastic needs of the masses. In consequence, Islam was pulled in two opposite directions by these two groups. The warrior group pulled Islam in the direction of a militaristic ethic and Sufism in that of mystical flight, both the direction of Islam representing, as it were, a bifurcated Islamic ethic failed to produce, as Weber would have us believe, the prerequisite congruent with the rise of rational capitalism. The second perspective of the Weberian construct of Islam is gained by observing the emphasis put on the political and economic structure of such later dynasties as the Abbasid, Mamluks, and the Ottoman. And this structure falls under Weber's general consideration of the patrimonial bureaucracies. This type of financial and political structure is dependent on the conquest of new lands, which were then exploited to maintain central bureaucracy. The political structure hinged on a complex balance of social forces represented by the Sultan, the military, the ulama, and the mass. Frequent dynastic coup d'etat, rendered political balance precarious, but surprisingly, the basic structure of society was left intact. The central political contradiction of the political structure of sultanism, in Weber's view, was the sultan's total dependence on the military, which all too frequently proved unreliable. The sultan used to hold on the power and retain his monopoly of power by curbing the growth of autonomous institutions and groups within the patrimonial society. In other words, an absence of a civil society, which we saw in the West, beginning with the Italian communes, and then, of course, the merchant class in the lowlands and eventually England and France. On the other hand, potentially independent social groups in the Islamic world were co-opted or assimilated into the military. The lawyers, the ulama generally, the merchants, they were all state official and emerged out of the imperial household. Coincidentally, Carl August Wittfogel, wonderful book on Oriental despotism, sheds some light on this issue of patrimonial society and despotism. Thus, a society structured and organized as such failed to develop the autonomous institution which Weber saw in Europe, facilitating the growth of capital. Weber also noted that this political structure failed to develop a rational and formal law because the ideal sacred law was subservient to the state and to political expediency. Similarly, city in Islamic society never developed beyond a military camp and a place of government business. This city also did not provide an environment suitable for the development of independent burghers and merchants. On the whole, the political system stressed such values as imitation and rejection of innovation. Thus, as we can see, it was not only attitude or ethic of Islam that militated against the creation and prerequisite for capitalism. The inhibiting factor was also the political position of the merchant class vis-a-vis the dominant military bureaucratic classes in Islamic society. So I think one can combine these two, in other words, the ethic of Islam itself in combination with the socio-economic development through history. Any questions and comments, feel free to put them in the comment section. And of course, never forget to thumbs up.
What do you want to watch?
Well, if you turn on channel 14, we can probably catch the end of Muslim Looney Tunes.
As a pig, I am very dirty and should not be touched by humans.